A 68-year-old wealthy widow paid her 29-year-old boyfriend $100,000 cash just to marry her. 3 weeks later, her body was floating face down in the ocean, and the truth about who wanted her dead will shatter everything you think you know about family, love and betrayal. Before we dive into this twisted tale of betrayal, hit that subscribe button, because the red flags in this story could save someone you love. In the rich suburbs of Newport Beach, California, the silence in Margaret Harris's mansion was deafening. Every morning for nearly a decade, the 68-year-old widow walked through rooms that echoed with memories of a life that once was. Her late husband, Jonathan's real estate empire, had left her with more money than she could ever spend, but all the wealth in the world couldn't fill the empty spaces left in her heart. She had everything money could buy, except the one thing she craved most. Margaret's children had their own complicated relationships with their mother and her fortune. Her 39-year-old son, Daniel Harris, maintained regular contact, though their conversations had grown strained over the years. Their relationship carried the weight of unspoken tensions and old wounds that never quite healed. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent, and the distance between them grew like a shadow. Her 35-year-old daughter, Emily Harris, visited occasionally, but seemed more interested in discussing inheritance matters after squandering her own portion of her father's fortune through poor investments and reckless spending that had left her financially desperate, despite receiving substantial wealth years earlier. Both children had busy lives that left little room for their aging mother, creating a family dynamic where Margaret felt more like an obligation than a beloved parent. The wealth that should have brought the family together had somehow created barriers, making her children treat her like a benefactor rather than someone who desperately needed their love and presence. Margaret Harris was trapped in a prison made of privilege, wealthy beyond measure but starving for something money couldn't purchase. The loneliness pressed against her chest like a physical weight, making each day feel longer than the last. During one of Emily's visits, she saw her mother was sinking deeper into depression. Margaret barely left the house, spoke to no one, and lived like a ghost in her own mansion. Emily pushed her mother to try online dating. Margaret protested she was too old and set in her ways, but Emily wouldn't accept excuses. Dating apps existed for people exactly like you, Mom, she said. Matured and accomplished women seeking genuine connection. Emily helped create a dating profile that night with simple pictures. Within days, matches started flooding in. Most were obvious predators and scammers targeting lonely widows. Margaret grew discouraged, watching the parade of inappropriate messages. Then Ryan Carter sent his request. His message stood out immediately. No crude comments or photo demands, just thoughtful words about seeking real connection with a woman of substance. His profile showed a handsome 29-year-old who claimed to prefer mature relationships over typical dating drama. Margaret hesitated at the age gap. Ryan was younger than her own children. Emily encouraged her mother to look past the numbers and focus on his words and apparent sincerity. Ryan's first call came that evening. His voice was warm and engaging. He asked about Margaret's life, interests and experiences. No one had shown such genuine curiosity about Margaret's thoughts in years. Ryan claimed he'd always connected better with older women. His generation was obsessed with superficial things, social media, partying, endless drama. He wanted depth, substance, and real conversation. Margaret found herself talking for hours. Ryan listened to every word, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and remembered details from previous conversations. The attention was intoxicating after years of feeling invisible. Age was just a number, Ryan insisted. What mattered was the connection between two souls. He felt something special developing with Margaret, something he'd never experienced with women his own age. The calls became nightly rituals. Ryan showered Margaret with attention she'd been desperately craving. He called her beautiful, intelligent, and fascinating. Younger women bored him with their shallow concerns and constant need for validation. Ryan had no interest in children or typical relationship drama. He wanted a partner who knew herself, who'd lived life, and who had wisdom earned through experience. Everything Margaret saw as disadvantages, her age, her quieter lifestyle, her past, Ryan presented as attractive qualities. Emily was thrilled watching her mother's transformation. Margaret started caring about her appearance again, looked forward to Ryan's calls, and smiled more than she had in years. The dating app experiment was working perfectly. Ryan escalated the romance with practiced precision. Within weeks he was calling Margaret his soulmate and claiming he'd never felt such a deep connection. Flowers arrived with romantic notes. He remembered her favorite wine and surprised her with thoughtful gifts that showed he'd been listening carefully. Margaret fell completely under his spell. Ryan provided attention when she felt invisible, charm when she felt worthless, and eager listening when others ignored her. He seemed to understand her loneliness in ways even her own children couldn't. The age gap that should have triggered warning bells became part of his appeal. Ryan convinced Margaret it proved their connection transcended superficial attraction, that their bond was based on souls recognizing each other across generational lines. Margaret believed she'd discovered her perfect match, a younger man who loved her mind, her experience, and her hard-earned sophistication, someone who saw her decades of life as assets rather than liabilities. If you were Margaret, would you recognize these red flags and walk away? Or would you continue enjoying the attention? Let us know in the comments. But Ryan's attention wasn't spontaneous affection. Every compliment was calculated manipulation. Every romantic gesture served his larger purpose. Every declaration of love moved him systematically closer to his real objective. Ryan had been studying Margaret from their first interaction, learning her vulnerabilities, mapping her desperate need for validation, and identifying exactly which emotional buttons to push. What Margaret didn't know was that Ryan's attention came with a very specific price tag. Daniel sensed trouble the moment Margaret mentioned Ryan's name during their weekly phone call. Something in his mother's voice had changed, a breathless excitement he hadn't heard since his father died, mixed with a defensive edge that put him immediately on guard. When Margaret revealed Ryan's age, Daniel felt his stomach drop. 29 years old, younger than Daniel himself, pursuing a 68-year-old widow worth millions. The situation screamed predator targeting vulnerable prey, yet Margaret couldn't see past her romantic fog. Daniel's warnings fell on deaf ears from the very first conversation about Ryan. His mother dismissed every concern before he could fully voice them, insisting that Ryan was different from other young men, that he was an old soul who genuinely preferred mature women over shallow girls his own age. The more Daniel pressed about the obvious red flags, the more defensive Margaret became about her relationship. She accused her son of being unable to accept her happiness, of being jealous that someone new was entering their family dynamic, of refusing to believe that real love could bloom between two people regardless of their ages. Their conversations grew increasingly heated as Daniel's protective instincts clashed with Margaret's desperate need to believe in Ryan's authenticity. Each phone call drove them further apart, with Margaret interpreting Daniel's legitimate concerns as personal attacks on her judgment and her newfound joy. Margaret began transforming under Ryan's influence in ways that alarmed Daniel even more. She started dressing younger, spending money more freely on elaborate dates and expensive gifts for Ryan, making impulsive decisions based on romantic excitement rather than the careful thought that had built her successful life. Emily's surprising support for their mother's relationship isolated Daniel further in his concerns. While he worried about obvious manipulation tactics, Emily encouraged Margaret to follow her heart and ignore Daniel's negative attitude, creating a family divide that played perfectly into a predator's hands. Should children interfere in their parents' relationships? Let us know below. Margaret's conviction that Ryan's attention was genuine blinded her to warning signs that would have been obvious under normal circumstances. Years of crushing loneliness had made her desperate enough to accept romantic interest from someone who clearly had ulterior motives targeting her wealth. The family rift widened with each conversation about Ryan, pushing Margaret further into isolation from the one person trying to protect her. She began avoiding Daniel's calls and limiting their visits, sharing less about her daily activities and growing more dependent on Ryan's version of reality. Daniel watched helplessly as his mother made increasingly reckless decisions while cutting off the people who cared about her most. Margaret's growing isolation eliminated her strongest source of realistic perspective, leaving her vulnerable to whatever Ryan had planned next. The manipulation was working exactly as designed. Margaret was choosing Ryan's validation over her family's protection, trading her son's genuine concern for a stranger's calculated affection. Daniel's attempts to save his mother were actually pushing her deeper into danger. Daniel had no idea that the real threat wasn't just Ryan. It was much closer to home. Just weeks into their whirlwind romance, Ryan revealed the crisis that would test Margaret's love in the most expensive way possible. He needed $100,000 in cash, and he needed it immediately, with a story that mixed genuine-sounding desperation with carefully crafted emotional manipulation. Ryan's explanation came out in perfectly timed pieces designed to maximize Margaret's sympathy while minimizing her ability to think clearly. He'd gotten involved with dangerous people before meeting her, made bad investments with worse partners, accumulated debts that now carried violent consequences he couldn't escape alone. The men he owed weren't patient creditors who accepted payment plans or negotiated terms. They'd made explicit threats against his safety, shown up at his apartment with intimidating messages, made it crystal clear that payment was due immediately or consequences would escalate beyond financial penalties. But Ryan framed his request as more than just debt settlement. This was a test of Margaret's commitment to their relationship, proof that she truly believed in their future together, enough to help him escape the mistakes of his past and start fresh with her. Margaret's rational mind screamed warnings about the timing, the amount, and the convenient urgency of Ryan's crisis. $100,000 was serious money even for someone with her wealth, and demanding it so early in their relationship felt like textbook financial manipulation. Ryan applied psychological pressure with surgical precision, explaining that he couldn't turn to family who'd disowned him over his poor choices, or friends who'd already refused to help him escape this dangerous situation. Margaret represented his only hope for salvation, his chance at redemption, his path to a clean start. The request came wrapped in romantic language designed to make Margaret feel heroic rather than victimized. This money would free them to build a real future together without the shadow of Ryan's past hanging over their happiness, making it an investment in love rather than simple charity. Ryan created artificial urgency around the timeline, insisting that the dangerous men wouldn't wait much longer before resorting to violence. Margaret held the power to save him, to save their relationship, to save their chance at building something beautiful together. Margaret wrestled with the decision through sleepless nights, torn between every rational instinct that screamed danger and her desperate need to believe that Ryan's love was worth such an enormous leap of faith. The internal battle between logic and loneliness raged for days. Daniel's earlier warnings about Ryan chasing her money felt prophetic now, yet Ryan's explanations seemed different somehow. He wasn't asking for personal gain but for their shared future, not seeking profit but seeking freedom from past mistakes. Ryan sweetened his manipulation with promises that felt genuine in Margaret's love-starved state. Once his debts were cleared, he'd never ask for money again, would find meaningful work, would contribute to their household, and prove his devotion through actions rather than just words. Margaret's crushing loneliness made rational analysis nearly impossible when weighed against the miracle of finding love at her age. Was she really going to let money destroy the first genuine happiness she'd felt since her husband's death? 10 years earlier, Ryan played his final psychological card masterfully, suggesting that if Margaret couldn't trust him during this crisis, their relationship had no real future anyway. True partners supported each other through difficult times, and this was her opportunity to prove their love could overcome any obstacle. Margaret's resistance crumbled under the emotional weight of potentially losing Ryan just when she'd found him. She convinced herself this was what real love looked like: sacrifice, trust, commitment despite uncertainty, and that Ryan deserved her faith after weeks of devoted attention. The bank visit felt surreal as Margaret withdrew $100,000 in cash, the physical weight of the money heavy in her hands, as she contemplated the magnitude of what she was risking for love. That $100,000 wasn't an investment in love. It was a down payment for something more horrific. Ryan insisted on speed once he had Margaret's money safely in his possession, pushing for immediate marriage with an urgency that should have raised red flags, but instead felt romantic to a woman desperate to secure her newfound happiness before it could disappear. Within weeks of receiving the $100,000, Ryan was planning their wedding with an enthusiasm that seemed to prove his genuine commitment to their relationship. No long engagement that might give Margaret time to reconsider, no opportunity for family members to interfere with their perfect love story. Margaret initially suggested something small and intimate, perhaps just immediate family and a few close friends, but Ryan had grander visions for their special day. This was their moment to celebrate publicly, to show the world that their love had triumphed over age differences and skeptics who doubted their connection. The wedding planning became Ryan's obsession as he selected every detail personally: an expensive oceanside resort for the venue, elaborate floral arrangements, premium catering, live music, and luxurious touches that transformed their ceremony into a $50,000 spectacle that drained more of Margaret's resources. Daniel's refusal to attend cut Margaret deeply, creating a painful absence that overshadowed her joy. But Emily's enthusiastic support for the wedding plans helped validate Margaret's decision to move forward, despite her son's disapproval and dire warnings about Ryan's motives. The ceremony itself looked picture-perfect from every angle, with Margaret glowing in ivory silk, while Ryan beamed in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, their obvious happiness radiating across the elegant venue as guests admired the stunning flowers and celebrated what appeared to be genuine love. The photographer captured their first dance, cake cutting, and champagne toasts, creating beautiful images of radiant happiness. But the camera missed Ryan's frequent text messages throughout the reception, urgent communications with someone not on the guest list that couldn't wait until after the ceremony. Guests departed that evening convinced they'd witnessed a beautiful love story, an older woman finding happiness again with a younger man who'd proven that genuine affection could transcend age differences and social expectations about appropriate relationships. Margaret believed she'd married her soulmate after Ryan had convinced her through weeks of devoted attention that their connection was special, destined, and worth any sacrifice she might need to make for their shared future. Ryan had successfully secured access to millions of dollars while eliminating most legal obstacles to claiming Margaret's entire estate, transforming their wedding from a celebration of love into the final step of a carefully orchestrated plan. While guests celebrated new love, the bride had already signed off her life for their honeymoon. Ryan selected the seaside resort location with calculated precision, choosing an oceanside destination that would provide the perfect cover for what he'd been planning since their first conversation. The romantic facade of their honeymoon getaway masked the deadly reality that Margaret was being led to her execution site disguised as paradise. Margaret trusted her new husband completely as they departed for what she believed would be the happiest days of her life, unaware that Ryan had researched every detail of the resort's layout, water conditions, and emergency response protocols. The isolation of their oceanfront suite eliminated witnesses while providing Ryan with multiple opportunities to stage the accident he'd been designing for weeks. Margaret's limited swimming abilities should have kept her away from deep water, but Ryan began immediately encouraging ocean activities despite her expressed concerns about the rough surf and her lack of confidence in open water. His gentle persistence wore down her resistance as he framed beach swimming as romantic bonding essential to their honeymoon experience. Ryan's behavior during their first days at the resort followed a careful script designed to establish his devoted husband persona among resort staff and other guests. He appeared attentive and loving in public while privately studying weather patterns, tide schedules, and the timing of lifeguard rotations. The resort's emergency response procedures became Ryan's obsession as he casually questioned staff about rescue protocols, response times, and the nearest medical facilities. His questions seemed like normal tourist curiosity about safety, but he was actually mapping the critical minutes between a water emergency and professional help arriving. Margaret noticed subtle changes in Ryan's demeanor once they arrived at the resort, sensing an underlying tension that hadn't existed during their courtship, but she attributed his distraction to wedding stress and the adjustment to married life rather than recognizing the signs of someone finalizing murder plans. Ryan's phone buzzed constantly with text messages he claimed were work-related, but his secretive responses and urgent typing suggested communications that couldn't wait, despite their romantic getaway. Margaret respected his privacy while unknowingly watching him coordinate the final details of her death. The ocean's beauty mesmerized Margaret as she stood on their balcony watching waves crash against the rocks below, never imagining that Ryan was studying those same waters as the instrument of her destruction. The romantic setting that should have created beautiful memories was actually the carefully selected stage for her final performance. Ryan's insistence on morning swims became more persistent each day, despite Margaret's repeated concerns about the dangerous-looking surf and her preference for the resort's safe swimming pool. His romantic pressure about sharing ocean experiences gradually overcame her practical objections about water safety. Margaret thought she was starting her new life as Ryan's beloved wife in paradise, but she was actually living through her final hours while her husband perfected the timing of her murder. Margaret thought she was starting her new life, but she end was nearer than anyone could imagine. The morning of Margaret's death began with Ryan's unusually urgent insistence that they take their ocean swim despite the rougher water conditions that had kept other resort guests safely on the beach. His romantic pressure about experiencing the ocean together finally overcame Margaret's instinctive concerns about the dangerous-looking surf. Margaret's hesitation about entering the choppy water should have been respected by any loving husband, but Ryan dismissed her fears as unnecessary worry while guiding her deeper into waves that were clearly beyond her swimming capabilities. A few other beachgoers present would later recall how uncomfortable Margaret appeared about the water conditions. Witnesses positioned on the beach watched the couple enter the ocean together, but their distance from the water meant they couldn't clearly observe the specific details of what happened once Margaret and Ryan moved into deeper water where the deadly currents could do their work. Margaret struggled almost immediately once they reached the depth Ryan had calculated would be perfect for his purposes, her limited swimming skills no match for the ocean's power that Ryan had studied extensively before selecting this particular morning for their final swim together. Ryan's behavior during Margaret's desperate struggle for survival revealed the true nature of his character, as multiple witnesses observed him standing motionless in the water, while his wife fought for her life just feet away from where he could have easily provided assistance. The critical 4 minutes between when Margaret's struggle became visible to beach observers and when Ryan finally called for help represented the difference between rescue and murder, a timeline that Ryan had carefully calculated to ensure that assistance would arrive too late to save his wife. Resort lifeguards responded immediately to Ryan's belated cries for help, but their rescue efforts were doomed by the precious time that had already been lost, while Ryan watched his wife drown without attempting any meaningful assistance or calling for help when intervention might have saved her life. Margaret's body was pulled from the water by professional rescuers who attempted CPR and emergency resuscitation, but the extended time underwater had already caused irreversible damage that made their heroic efforts ultimately futile despite their expertise and determination to save her. Ryan's performance as the devastated new widower began immediately as he collapsed in apparent grief beside Margaret's lifeless body, his Oscar-worthy display of shock and sorrow convincing resort staff and emergency responders that they were witnessing a tragic accident rather than a carefully orchestrated murder. The initial investigation treated Margaret's death as a drowning accident involving an elderly woman who had entered dangerous water conditions beyond her swimming ability, with Ryan portrayed as the helpless husband who couldn't save his beloved wife despite his desperate attempts to rescue her. Ryan's detailed account of the drowning painted himself as a loving husband who had tried everything possible to save Margaret but couldn't overcome the ocean's power, his emotional testimony convincing investigators that no criminal activity had occurred during what appeared to be a tragic honeymoon accident. Resort management handled the situation with professional sympathy while treating Ryan as a grieving widower deserving of support and compassion rather than suspicion, their response enabling him to maintain his innocent facade. while beginning the process of claiming Margaret's estate. Emergency medical personnel who examined Margaret's body found evidence consistent with accidental drowning, with no obvious signs of foul play that might have triggered a more thorough criminal investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death in Paradise. Ryan's immediate phone calls after Margaret's death was officially declared included urgent communications with parties unknown to resort staff, conversations that seemed inconsistent with a man who had just lost his beloved wife in a tragic accident. The authorities called it a tragic accident, but someone who loved Margaret wasn't buying it. Daniel's instincts screamed murder from the moment he received Ryan's phone call reporting Margaret's accidental drowning, every detail of the story feeling wrong to someone who knew his mother's cautious nature and her well-documented fear of deep water that made ocean swimming completely out of character. The official accident report satisfied local authorities who had no reason to suspect foul play in what appeared to be a straightforward drowning, but Daniel's intimate knowledge of his mother's behavior patterns made him certain that Margaret would never have voluntarily entered dangerous ocean conditions, regardless of romantic pressure. Ryan's emotional performance during their phone conversation struck Daniel as carefully rehearsed rather than spontaneous grief, with specific details about the drowning sounding too polished and convenient for someone who should have been traumatized by watching his wife die in his arms. Daniel's decision to hire private investigator Carmen Rodriguez represented his last hope of uncovering the truth about his mother's death when official channels had already closed the case, treating it as a resolved accident that required no further investigation into potential criminal activity. Carmen's initial background check on Ryan Carter revealed a pattern of relationships with older, wealthy women that had ended under suspicious circumstances, suggesting that Margaret wasn't his first target, but rather the latest victim in a series of calculated romantic manipulations designed to access substantial assets. The financial investigation uncovered Ryan's most damning actions in the days immediately following Margaret's death, when he had moved with suspicious speed to claim her assets rather than grieving like a genuine widower who had lost his beloved partner in a tragic accident. Bank records revealed that Ryan had initiated the transfer of Margaret's entire estate into his personal accounts within hours of her death being officially declared, demonstrating a level of preparation and urgency that contradicted his claims of being devastated by the unexpected loss of his wife. The timeline of legal document changes painted a clear picture of premeditation, as Carmen discovered that Ryan had convinced Margaret to modify her will and insurance policies just days before their honeymoon, ensuring that he would inherit everything immediately upon her death without any complications or delays. Life insurance companies provided evidence that Ryan had pushed Margaret to increase her coverage amounts significantly during their brief marriage, with the beneficiary changes naming him as the sole recipient of policies worth millions of dollars that would be paid out regardless of how her death occurred. Carmen's forensic analysis of the resort's security footage revealed inconsistencies in Ryan's account of the drowning, showing that he had positioned himself at a specific distance from Margaret that would allow him to watch her struggle without being close enough for bystanders to expect him to provide immediate assistance. Witness interviews conducted by Carmen uncovered details that the original investigation had missed, including observations about Ryan's strange behavior before, during, and after Margaret's drowning that suggested calculated planning rather than spontaneous tragedy striking an unsuspecting couple. The digital forensics investigation into Ryan's phone and computer records would prove to be the most shocking discovery of all, revealing communications that would completely destroy the narrative of a loving husband who had lost his wife in a tragic accident while they were enjoying their honeymoon. Ryan's internet search history told the story of someone who had been researching drowning accidents, ocean safety, and life insurance claims procedures for weeks before Margaret's death, demonstrating clear evidence of premeditation that transformed the case from accident to murder. Carmen's investigation methodology involved following the money trail backward from Ryan's immediate asset seizure to the original dating app contact, revealing a systematic pattern of targeting and manipulation that had been building toward Margaret's death from their very first conversation. The evidence of premeditation became undeniable as Carmen assembled bank records, legal documents, insurance policies, witness statements, and digital communications into a comprehensive case that proved Ryan had been planning Margaret's murder since the beginning of their relationship. But the most devastating discovery was still hidden in Ryan's phone, waiting to reveal a betrayal that would destroy everything Daniel thought he knew about his family. But the most devastating discovery was still hidden in Ryan's phone. Carmen's digital forensics team cracked Ryan's phone encryption and discovered a hidden cache of text messages that would shatter every assumption about Margaret's murder, revealing communications between Ryan and someone whose identity would destroy Daniel's understanding of his own family forever. The message thread between Ryan and Emily stretched back months before Margaret had even created her dating profile, proving that their mother's romantic relationship had been orchestrated from the very beginning by the two people she trusted most in the world. Emily's role in Margaret's murder became horrifyingly clear through hundreds of text exchanges where she provided Ryan with detailed intelligence about their mother's emotional vulnerabilities, financial assets, daily routines, and the specific psychological manipulation tactics that would be most effective against someone desperate for companionship. The conspiracy between Ryan and Emily had begun with Emily's mounting resentment about her mother's vast fortune remaining out of her reach, while she struggled with gambling debts and failed business ventures that had left her desperate for immediate access to Margaret's millions. Ryan Carter wasn't just Margaret's predatory husband, or even a random gold digger who had targeted a lonely widow. He was Emily's secret boyfriend, who had been recruited specifically to seduce and marry her own mother as part of a calculated plan to inherit the family fortune through murder. Emily's text messages revealed her intimate knowledge of Margaret's loneliness and her strategic decision to encourage her mother's online dating as a way of introducing Ryan into their family dynamics without arousing Daniel's suspicion about the connection between the supposed stranger and Emily herself. The dating app encounter that Margaret believed was serendipitous romance had actually been carefully orchestrated by Emily, who had helped Ryan craft his profile specifically to appeal to their mother's particular vulnerabilities, while positioning him as the perfect solution to her emotional and physical isolation. Emily's enthusiastic support for Margaret's relationship with Ryan throughout their courtship took on a sinister new meaning when viewed through the lens of her secret partnership with the man who was systematically manipulating their mother toward financial and physical destruction. The $100,000 cash payment that had seemed like Ryan's first major exploitation of Margaret's wealth was actually Emily's idea, designed to test their mother's complete devotion to Ryan, while also providing immediate funds that the conspirators could use to finance their planned disappearance after Margaret's death. Emily's presence at the wedding as Margaret's supportive maid of honor represented the ultimate betrayal, as she helped her mother sign the legal documents that would transfer the entire estate to Ryan, knowing that those signatures were literally authorizing her own mother's execution. The text messages between Emily and Ryan during Margaret's wedding reception showed their excitement about the successful completion of the legal paperwork phase, with Emily celebrating that their mother had signed everything and they were almost free to begin their new life together, funded by matricide. Ryan's communications with Emily from the honeymoon resort revealed the final countdown to Margaret's murder, with messages about ocean currents being perfect tomorrow and instructions to Emily about playing the grieving daughter convincingly when news of the tragic accident reached the family. Emily's immediate response to news of Margaret's death had struck Daniel as surprisingly composed for someone who had just lost her mother. But the text messages revealed that her controlled grief was actually relief that their plan had succeeded without complications or suspicion from authorities. The conspiracy extended beyond just murder to include Emily and Ryan's detailed plans for their shared future using Margaret's money, with discussions about new identities, foreign bank accounts, and destinations where they could disappear together without leaving traces for investigators to follow. Emily's gambling debts and business failures had made her desperate enough to participate in her own mother's murder, with text messages showing her calculating exactly how much of Margaret's estate would be needed to cover her obligations and fund their escape to a country without extradition treaties. Have you ever been betrayed by family? Share your story in the comments. The digital evidence revealed that Margaret's marriage had been nothing but an elaborate setup orchestrated by her own daughter, who had recruited her boyfriend to seduce, marry, and murder their mother for an inheritance that Emily couldn't access through normal means. Daniel's horrifying realization that his sister had conspired with her lover to murder their mother represented a level of family betrayal that defied comprehension, destroying his understanding of the people he thought he knew and loved. A daughter who helped murder her own mother for money. Carmen Rodriguez presented her evidence to federal authorities, who immediately recognized the scope of the conspiracy and launched a coordinated investigation that would bring both perpetrators to justice for their heinous crime against Margaret Harris and the family they had destroyed. Ryan Carter's arrest came first as FBI agents surrounded him at Margaret's former mansion, where he had been living as the grieving widower while liquidating her assets and preparing for his planned disappearance with Emily to start their blood money-funded new life together. Emily's arrest followed within hours, as federal agents took her into custody at her apartment, where they discovered additional evidence of the conspiracy, including forged documents, travel plans to non-extradition countries, and communications with offshore banking contacts who specialized in helping criminals hide stolen assets. The community reacted with shock and horror when news broke about the daughter who had conspired with her boyfriend to murder her own mother for inheritance money, a level of family betrayal that seemed impossible to comprehend even in an area accustomed to wealthy families and their complicated dynamics. The trial became a media sensation as prosecutors presented the overwhelming digital evidence that proved Emily and Ryan had planned Margaret's murder from the moment they conceived their relationship, with Emily recruiting her boyfriend specifically to seduce and kill their mother for her fortune. Ryan's defense team attempted to portray him as a young man who had been manipulated by Emily into participating in her family's destruction, but the text messages clearly showed his enthusiastic participation in planning Margaret's death and his eager anticipation of inheriting her millions. Emily's lawyers tried to minimize her role by claiming she had only provided information to Ryan without understanding his murderous intentions, but the evidence demonstrated her active participation in every phase of the conspiracy, from initial planning through execution and cover-up. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for both defendants, with Ryan sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Margaret's murder and Emily receiving 25 years for conspiracy and accessory charges. Daniel's victim impact statement during sentencing described the devastating betrayal of losing not only his beloved mother to murder, but also discovering that his own sister had orchestrated her death, leaving him as the sole survivor of a family destroyed by greed and unthinkable treachery. The investigation revealed that Ryan had been in contact with several other wealthy widows through various dating platforms, suggesting that Margaret might not have been his first victim, and that Emily's recruitment of him had potentially saved other innocent women from similar fates. Margaret Harris's legacy became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of isolated elderly people to predators who exploit loneliness and desperation for companionship, with her story inspiring new legislation to protect seniors from romance scams and financial exploitation. In the end, Margaret's money couldn't buy love, but it did buy justice. Her fortune may have made her a target, but her son's love made sure her killers paid the price. Love should never come with a price tag, and family should never come with conditions. Hit subscribe to stay alert to these deadly red flags and protect the vulnerable people in your life, because sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to home.